forward about some predictions of the future and some traditional ways of looking at how we look at where the future is coming from. We are trying to expose you into some other ways to think about that, maybe ways that would be better able to help you prepare. So we're very, very pleased to have Patrick Marren join us from the other side of the planet. And he is the principal of Futures Strategy Group, which specializes in strategy and scenario planning. He has 35 years of experience in business strategy consulting, corporate finance, and strategic planning. At FSG, Patrick has led or participated in engagements for clients in the transportation, airline, finance, pharmaceutical, chemical, food ingredient, and high-tech industries, as well as for 15 different federal agencies of the U.S. government, several military branches, the U.S. intelligence community. We won't hold that against you. And
they didn't listen to anything I said.
Yeah, that would have been good. Patrick has an MBA in finance from the University of Chicago and a bachelor's degree in government from Harvard. He had a regular column in the Journal of Business Strategy for about a decade and has written and spoken extensively on future and on organizational strategy. He speaks, reads, and writes Greek and currently resides in Auckland, New Zealand. He is the author of the forthcoming Fatal Certainty: How a Cult of Prediction Made the 21st Century into an Era of Strategic Shock, and how rigorous imagination can bring us back. We look forward to hearing about that, Patrick, and I'll turn it over to you.
This is going to be a little different from the other presentations because I have way too many slides. So I'm going to be beating you with the fire hose. I hope it's okay.
That never happens.
It never happens. And I hope I can figure out how to do this. She's already told you everything about me. Let's see here. Is that working?
Yeah. Have you clicked into the presentation?
How do I was doing that?
That would be it if it's connected.
Oh, okay.
Again.
All right.
Is it right?
Boom. Oops. All right. And I can get rid of this too. I found out.
Yeah, you can find
learning organization. Hide loading. After sitting through the last one, not being able to see everything at the top. Okay, I'm going to talk really fast. I'm going to get my auctioneer voice on. I'm going to talk about fatal certainty and how to avoid it, I hope. It's still not working. Am I going down? Oh, there we go. Okay, you already heard all of this.
Okay.
The only things I could add to this are I am one of nine kids. I'm the shortest of 6 brothers. I used to be the tallest. That's my tragedy. They all went like right past me. And I have 26 nieces and nephews, but no kids. So, and I'm finance MBA in recovery for 37 years now. So, and I'm current resident in New Zealand. We've heard that certain people here can take a fall really well. So the national rugby team would like to talk to you.
Take a hit, come right.
So there you go. So what I want you to walk away with, if I can get on there. First of all, stuff that's, your personal belongings, just look under your seats after you leave. So, but what I really want you to walk away with is the idea that there's a cult of prediction that explains a significant amount of why we keep getting surprised since the turn of the century, turn of the millennium. There's a massive sphere of strategic uncertainty that prediction cannot help us with, but people keep using predictive approaches to things that shouldn't be predicted. But there's a different way to deal with really fundamental, unquantifiable, irreducible uncertainty. And we need to use it more, refine it, honor it, teach it, and get better at it and reward it. So anyway, just to start out, it's sort of like somebody threw a switch at the millennium. This is going to be sort of US focused, but Western world also. Things were very smooth, and then all of a sudden they got very rough right after the year 2000. First, we had 9/11 in 2001. In 2003, we had the Iraq War, which turned out not to be such a cakewalk. 2007 to 2009, and actually long after that as well, repercussions with the global financial crisis hit. You had a few years, you had COVID-19 hitting. And then since 2021, we've had worldwide inflation. And these things were not anticipated. They could have been anticipated, but they weren't. So that wasn't anticipated there. So why have all these shocks occurred? And to be fair, it's not all about this fatal certainty that I talked about. Partly we were set up by a great moderation. we had 2 decades during which we were complaining constantly about all the crises we were going through, but actually they were really, really placid by historical standards. Terrorism was far away, if you were an American especially, terrorism was far away, did not kill too many Americans. War, we had 2 wars in the 90s, or that turned out to be almost push button victories for the United States. Culminated the Kosovo War, which we achieved all of our aims without a single boot being put on the ground and no killed in action. 2 people were killed in a training accident in theater, but nobody was actually killed in the war. So that was pretty good, and it kind of spooked our potential rivals. So we were feeling pretty good about that. Financial crises, we had the savings and loan crisis, but it came, and it would cost us a ton of money, but it came in the midst of a general expansion, and we sort of ate it without anybody getting anybody's oxes getting bored. Then we had the long-term capital management, which was just a blip, but might not have been. It might have been the Lehman Brothers in 1998 instead of 2008. But Alan Greenspan banged some heads together on Wall Street and fashioned a bailout of that outfit. And within 2 years, the principals were doing the same hedge fund stuff that they had done before. In terms of pandemics, we had AIDS, and that killed 700,000 Americans. But it didn't quite strike the heart of America because it happened to somebody else, different type of people. Worldwide, it was very different. It was 30 million people who died, and it was not confined to one group of people. But eventually the government and pharmaceutical companies came up with a cocktail of drugs that would make it a livable disease. And so, and then finally, inflation was in 1980, 79 and 80, it was 13.5, 12%. But then it was cured very painfully through a recession when rates were jacked up almost to 20% in certain months. And except for a rise to about 6% by 1990 due to a lot of government spending on the military, it never really got above 4% for the next decade. And in fact, until 2021. So it was really almost a 40-year lack of real inflation. So we had this moderation going on. So that the mindset at the millennium is, this is a predictable place. The world's predictable. We've got the expert wisdom of authorities, and now we got brand new high-tech tools. It's year 2000, and data sets we've never had before, and we can predict the future using those. And experts, they pretty much knew what they were talking about. People would complain about them, but people thought they could use the past to predict the future. And somebody out there knew what was going to happen and could take care of things. And even when bad things happen, institutions and the authorities that ran them could handle the fallout. And the general trend in the world was positive, and it looked like it was just going to keep going. We had crossed the bridge into the 21st century, and everything was going to be great. We'd had 96 straight months of growth in jobs, and it all looked pretty good. So what happened? Partly the cult of prediction. I'm not going to say this is the sole cause, but I think it's a big, it was a big cause of a lot of the surprise that we have seen, and it hasn't gotten enough attention. There are 2 flavors that I identify with the cult of prediction. One is we've always had with us, and the 2 flavors combined were in some proportion in each of these cases. The traditional unhip version of the cult of prediction was based on authority. A lot of times academic authority, elite academic authority, based on often quantitative mental models. Sometimes they're quantitative though, in finance and economics. And they were a ticket to the elite. You had to be inculcated in these mental models to get into the elite and be a leader and to make some of these decisions based on this cult of prediction. And it's the traditional source of surprises through history. We had these all the way through. The other one, the new version, it also is based on the past, but it's based on databases that didn't exist before. So we have databases and we have tools to manipulate them and to analyze them. And that is because data collection and processing capacity, as we have heard, is just gone through the roof. I don't even know what a zettabyte is, but I know it used to be measured in petabytes. So now we're up to zettabytes. I don't know what comes after that. But if 2 zettabytes of data were produced in 2010, produced and consumed, is up to 147 zettabytes estimated this year. That's what the estimate is for this year. So it's gone up by about 70 times in 14 years. And basically, we take this data and we use algorithms to predict the future. And the assumptions in these algorithms are often hidden, unexamined. And it's a real force multiplier. It's very, and AI, as we heard, if you were in the room for the last presentation, may actually pour a little more gasoline on this fire. But this quantitative forecasting is sort of gasoline on the fire for the old time religion of cult of prediction. And it's really seductive to the type of people who run organizations. They're very left brain people. I mean, I think a lot of us are. I mean, even I am a left brain person, you know. And it's seductive. It's great to think you can predict the future. You know, we all like to, Americans and other people like to gamble and, you know, calculate odds and win and have the right answer, So it's very much in vogue today, even with manifest failures over the years. So examining the surprises we've seen, 9/11 might have been the last of the completely old-time religion version of the cult of prediction, because it was almost completely based on an elite authority mental model of terrorism, that terrorism had to be sponsored by state sponsors in order to really do damage to the United States. I mean, I happen to be working in the bowels of the Bush administration in certain areas on national security things at that point. And I can tell you terrorism was not what I was working on. They were very much enamored of a sort of Kissingerian great power theory of how things were working. And if anything, they were setting up, they were looking for something that looked like a Cold War to go back into, because they were very comfortable working in that system. And all of them had grown up in it. And they had a little disdain for the previous administration. They thought non-state actors were just sort of a hippie obsession. So when 9/11 occurred, all of a sudden, they just hurled this view out the window, but they had to replace it with something. And the global war on terror took its place, and which led to the Iraq War, where a couple of my cousins went there, and I don't think I share DNA with them, because one's a Navy SEAL and the other's a Marine sniper, and they make me, I live in fear that they're gonna, you know, come and do terrible things to me, but they're nice guys. But the Iraq War was also a mistake based on an alternative expert elite theory by the Project for the New American Century, which was toward a neo-Reaganite foreign policy, which was kind of ironic because although Reagan was a very staunch Cold Warrior, we didn't go to war to change countries into democracies too much. We didn't do it on that scale. We didn't just completely invade in a big war kind of way. We had the Contras and we had a few other things. But when the Marines were in Lebanon and were attacked and 240 of them were killed, he simply withdrew them. Very few people remember that. But again, the Iraq War was an example of fighting the most recent past war. It was a past-based thing. The most recent past wars, as I said, were sort of push-button victories for the United States. And they decided that that was going to work. And they used predictive metrics that talked about how to win a war, but not how to win the peace necessarily. And they didn't take into account the fact that the aims had changed and were much, much more ambitious. So huge decisions were made, like Paul Bremer rolling out of bed in the morning and saying, we're dissolving the Iraqi army, which ended up being the basis of the insurgency because a whole lot of armed and suddenly unemployed young men were out there. Global financial crisis really was the big new religion sort of version of the cult of prediction, because it was based, I'll go down to the bottom here and talk about 25 standard deviations. Because Goldman Sachs had a model of the mortgage market, And in 2007, when the first rumblings were appearing, their CFO told the press, we were seeing 25 standard deviation moves day after day. Because anyone taken a statistics course? Anyone taken a statistics course here? Okay. The odds of that are 1 to all of the number of all the particles in the universe, and then add 50 zeros. And yeah, zettabytes. Yes, exactly. And some statisticians at Queen's University in Belfast put out a paper that showed that was the equivalent of winning the UK lottery every day for 3 weeks. And so I said, this just doesn't happen. It was basically someone saying, no responsible human being would ever rely on Goldman Sachs models of the mortgage market. So clearly, over-reliance on these faulty quantitative models was a force multiplier for the havoc that occurred in 2008. COVID-19 happened in 2020. And the only useful historical parallel would have been the Spanish flu, but it wasn't a good analogy in many ways. There was reliance on some faulty patch-based models, quantitative models of pandemic spread that you can read about in Michael Lewis's The Premonition. And one of the key assumptions of that model was that you had to get the kids out of school, because in previous pandemics, kids being in school they would be 18 inches from each other, and then they would come home and they would spread it to grandma and grandpa, and they would die, and so everybody had to stay home from school. And that didn't happen, and we may never know why, because we're not really doing testing now anymore, and the kind of research that would be necessary to understand why that didn't happen. And elite authorities did not help themselves, like Anthony Fauci. He's taking some heat for other things this week, but I think one thing that he maybe legitimately faulted for was he kind of assumed that Americans were scientists, that they understood when he said in March of 2020, masks are useless, don't worry about it. Supposedly because he knew we didn't have enough masks and that the people in the hospitals that were working there needed them. But a month later, he said, everybody's got a mask up. And he lost a ton of credibility, and I don't think he ever really understood just how completely he lost a large part of the American people and rendered public health response to that crisis very, very difficult. And of course, there was a new phenomenon of social media, which elevated conspiracy theories to at least the same level as science. Inflation. Good news. Some economists did predict inflation this time. But unfortunately, the ones that did predict inflation had been predicting inflation since about the 1980s. And so it was kind of a boy that cried wolf situation. But even after the mass injections of COVID relief in 2020, which were huge by historical standards, most economists, when inflation didn't immediately jump up, they just assumed that, we're in this new world where inflation doesn't occur. And when it jumped to 7% in 2021 and stayed at 6.5% in 2022, economists scrambled. And they scrambled into two basic camps. One was team transitory, which was led by Paul Krugman, who said, okay, this is just a supply chain disruption. It's going to go away like the previous inflations, like after World War II. And then team permanent, led by people like Larry Summers, who said we're going to need another Paul Volcker type of recession to squeeze this out. And who was right? It's impossible to say. And inflation isn't completely gone yet, and we don't know whether it's going to go up, down, or whatever. It's unpredictable. So keep that in the back of your mind. It's fundamentally unpredictable. Economists spend way too much time trying to predict things. But the result is the public lost even more faith in institutions and elite expert authorities. So, thank goodness, we have learned the vital lesson here. We need more prediction. I have been reading a series of books over the years, as I'm sure a lot of you have. Some best-selling books since 2007 on decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. The first book is in a separate group by itself, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. If you've never read The Black Swan, it's very entertaining. He's a very angry man. He is very obstreperous, but he's kind of brilliant. And one of his chapter heading is called "We Just Can't Predict." And although he is he is referenced by a couple of the other authors here, they haven't taken that aboard, because every one of these other people thinks that the only serious way to deal with future uncertainty is to use Bayesian prediction techniques. And so Daniel Kahneman, who was a Nobel Prize winning, he was actually a psychologist, but he won the economics prize in 2002, wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. Brilliant book. I've got a lot of respect for all the people on this list, by the way. But these books only deal with a very thin sliver of real human decision-making, games, medical tests, things that are very hard science that are very predictable, okay? And that's not what CEOs have to deal with when they're making decisions. So you can see that I had a little time when I should have been cutting half these slides last week. I ended up making an influence diagram of all these books. And you can see Black Swan at top. The blue lines are Kahneman and Tetlock and Gardner were influenced a little bit, or at least engaged with Taleb. The rest didn't. I guess they didn't want to take that non-prediction thing into account. Kahneman was very, very influential, the green lines. So he's cited in all these other works, every one of the other works, his work. Tetlock is the most cited because he seems to have found a way to use prediction that superficially looks like it's a serious thing. I don't want to be nasty. The dotted line is because Kahneman wrote both of these books, so obviously it had something to do with noise as well. Anyway, and Tom Travers is at the bottom. He wrote Everything is Predictive, and that was released about 4 weeks ago. And it really talked about gasoline on the fire. I was thinking, is this really a thing? This cult of prediction? And then he wrote Everything is Predictable. I said, oh yeah, it's still a thing. It's a bestseller, and people think everything is predictable. It's not. Spoiler alert, it's not. So I'm going to do a case study, The Rise of the Super Forecasters. This is Philip Tetlock. He's at Penn. And he's got a great business with the super forecasters. He originally did this book, Expert Political Judgment, How Good Is It? How Can We Know, in 2005, which was a real, it was a contribution because he tested 284 political pundits and had them answer very specific questions about things in politics. And essentially they were all phrased, here's a phenomenon. Will there be less of this by a date certain, the same amount, or more? And he had them answer all these questions, and it turned out they were really, really terrible at prediction. And even I mean, some of them were like TV pundits, but some of them were subject matter experts. So the headline result was dart-throwing monkeys would have been better because they could have answered 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 all the way across and done better than they actually did. And it actually was worse when they were in an area where they supposedly had a higher expertise. So he went from there to his follow-up super forecasting in 2015. And he thought to himself, okay, these people are terrible. Is it possible to identify or train people who are better predictors? And he founded the Good Judgment Project. And the Good Judgment Project auditioned thousands of people to see if they were good predictors or could be made into good predictors, and eventually winnowed the number down to 260 best, and educated them in Bayesian prediction approaches. And they went into the ACE forecasting tournament, which is run by IARPA, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency. And they would pose 100 to 150 questions each year to research teams. There were various research teams that entered this contest. And they had to generate daily collective forecasts. So it was the average of these 260 people's opinion, percentage-wise, on each of these questions that were similar. They're very objective, so you could see who was right and who was wrong. I put a question mark here because what is a realistic probability? I don't know what that is, but so Good Judgment Project won both seasons of the contest. And after that, after 2 seasons, IARPA was only funding the GJP, and they gave them access to the integrated conflict early warning system. So sleep well, Americans, because random people in their basements that were cleared by a University of Pennsylvania professor, have access to classified intelligence and keep it safe. So super forecasters are still used today. And these are the kind of questions they were answering for the intelligence community. And the Economist uses them every year. I think Bloomberg uses them fairly regularly as well to predict certain things. And here's what they predicted for 2023 in the Economist's year to come issue that they issue at the end of the year every year to predict 2023 events in November 2022. So you can see here, global growth between 1.5 and 3% was their range. The actual so far appears to be 3%. But you can see going down this outcome of Turkish election. And if you look through these, looks like they did a pretty good job. Was the China GDP growth, who knows how realistic that 5% is, but it was within their range. Will Russia detonate nuclear weapons in Ukraine? 95% no. Doesn't seem to have happened. Will Putin cease to lead Russia by October 1st of 23? Didn't happen, right? So what's not to love here? They were right about just about everything. Even got the Nigerian election right, although it was only 53%. Okay. Now I'm going back to Nate Silver, is the signal and the noise. He's the political prognosticator. He wrote this in 2012, right after he had correctly picked 50 out of 50 states for the Obama-Romney election. So he was at the height of his reputation. He said, we need to stop in a minute. We have a prediction problem. We love to predict things, but we're not good at it. But he said, if prediction is the problem, it is also its solution. And my answer to that is wrong. Prediction itself is the problem, specifically prediction of things for which prediction is impossible or useless. Now let's go back to those predictions that super forecasters made for the economists, which again, similar to the types of things they were doing for the intelligence community. For the intelligence community, they're answering, okay, will China have control of such and such an island in the South China Sea by December 31st of such and such a year? Will 2 Russian top leaders switch jobs as Putin and Medvedev had once again by December 31st, blah, blah, blah. Okay. My question is, what decisions could you make as a result of any of these numbers? And my answer, none. You can't make any decisions based on any of these. For every one of these questions, I mean, for Russia nuking Ukraine, to have a 95% chance, and it's just the opinion of these people, by the way, would that mean that you don't have to plan for Russia nuking, detonating a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, just because these people said there was a 95% chance it wouldn't happen? I think if you were the United States or Ukraine, you would have to have some contingency planning anyway for that. But it's true of all of them. When it comes to mission critical decisions, and foresight is about decisions in the face of fundamental uncertainty. It's not about percentage chance of this or that, because unless you can be 100% certain about something, which we almost never are, you're still going to have to plan for the alternative outcome.
Pat, just a quick question. I'm loving this. And I'm seeing you're in the right audience, because part of the problem is you're with business to business marketers here. Okay. Well, I was managing all of TI's market communications. I'm a PhD physicist. Okay. So I'm used to God not changing, whatever you want, not changing. The F still equals MA no matter where I'm at. I can predict what's going to happen with this, and I'm used to the idea, and you spend your whole life learning how to predict future behavior from past behavior using laws that don't change, because as best we can tell, God never changed his mind. You set up the laws of physics, that was it. Yeah. People, on the other hand, are different, but I think I'm resonating with the idea, well, it's easier for us as scientists and technologists trying to do marketing to get led down this garden path. Well, surely, I mean,
especially if you got a quantitative background.
Yeah, this is just statistical thermodynamics. We can get it. So this is I think particularly eye-opening for those of us with a science background who are doing marketing, which is a lot of things that we work with that I've worked with.
Come to a budget meeting, please.
Yeah, right, yeah, absolutely. And I'm getting to that. And I will get to
Yeah,
that.
there you go.
So, I mean, we all want certainty. We have a group that says, give me a prophet, give me prophecy. Tell me what's going to be and what's not going to be. If you say something 73% likely, or for the 2016 election, as Nate Silver said, it's a 71% chance that Hillary Clinton would win the election. Well, everyone went to sleep, but it was worse than that because the time leading up to the election, all they were doing was looking at that number and seeing it swing back. They weren't thinking about what either outcome actually would mean for their lives or for the government or for anything else. It's kind of a waste of brain space to do that. So probabilities are extremely misleading because you either say, oh, gonna happen, not gonna happen, and then you stop thinking. And they all go to 0 or 1 in the end. So there is no I won 27% of the presidential election. It's, you know, it doesn't work that way. So what is the nature? Okay, anybody? What is the?
Were you asking where there is
Question
a?
of me?
Yeah, you raised your hand. I was just.
Oh, yeah, well, I guess I had sort of an abstract question. I mean, I feel like it's almost human nature that like this idea that we can predict things is comforting to me. Like,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
and maybe it's something that I can't really get past, that I'm going to try to predict this. Do you think that there is a block that you can come in here and say, you know, you're not going to achieve any meaningful decisions by trying to follow these predictive models?
Yeah.
But can we really stop ourselves from going down that path, like on a fundamental level, because of our own nature?
Well, like the worldwide gambling industry hopes that you never stop doing that. And it's a $90 billion industry now. So
But there's some more mundane problems we face as business leaders that do lend themselves to.
sure, yes. And I want to say there are
Yeah.
predictable
I
things.
need to forecast
in the world.
5 or 10 years of sales to build this chemical plant in Thailand or not, right? It's things like that. I want to try to predict, and will this new product be a win for the targeted segment?
Yeah, but I think you need, and I'll show you an alternative way to at least begin to frame that discussion. Because what is the nature of fundamental uncertainty? The kind of fundamental uncertainty I'm talking about here. And often it deals with intersubjective realities. How many people read *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari? Or no? So it's a good read. And he didn't invent the idea of intersubjective realities, but it's a very useful concept. They are imaginary entities that create a web of meaning across millions of minds and organize people's actions and organize group action in certain ways and give meaning, basically. They can be value of currencies, fashions, national social cohesion. Financial markets are essentially mass opinion. It's like what's her name? I'm forgetting it. The comedian who she said, I think of one of her characters said, I think of reality as just a collective hunch. And that's what a lot of it is. A financial market is just a collective hunch. And that's why it can drop like a stone or even more faster than a stone when people's minds change about something. And they may be wrong when their minds change. And we had that flash crash in 1987, for example. Anyway, they're very important, but these examples you can see, they're not material items. They're not subject to the laws of physics. The S&P 500 does not, abide by the laws of physics. It doesn't have to. It's an intersubjective reality, like the designator hitter rule or something. Any system of rules. So you can't predict or analyze the future for intersubjective reality. You can't predict it reliably. They change as rapidly and as inexplicably as human opinions do, because that's essentially what they are. So they're therefore much more complex and chaotic than any kind of hard science phenomena that are amenable to prediction. And a lot of things are, and the things should be predicted. If you can predict things, you should predict them and do a good job at it. But also there's no data about the future. And if you're using data and an algorithm to predict what's going to happen, you're extrapolating from the past. Well, what you really need to know if you're in the CEO chair is, when is this algorithm going to cease working? That's really what you want to know. So what can we possibly do? And now I'm going to hopefully give you throw you a life ring. We need a new system of thinking. Daniel Kahneman, who died March 27th, by the way, the Nobel Prize winner. He wrote this great book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And he identified two systems of human thinking. One was fast and instinctive and intuitive for things that are well understood, things you've done all the time, driving an expressway that you've commuted on for years. System two was slow and methodical, painstaking for tasks that require very effortful attention, or are new or difficult or not well understood. I think he identified things like looking for one red-haired woman in a crowd as system two, parking in a place that you're not familiar with a very narrow lines that you've got to get into. That's system two. And also counting the number of instances of the letter A on a page. There are 30 in this, by the way. I hope. I'm not very good at effortful thinking, but I think that's the number. But system one and system two both deal with well-defined tasks. So what system do you use when you don't know what the task quite is? You don't know what it is. And what system did Kahneman use when he was coming up with his book about the two systems of thinking fast and slow? And I think we need a new system, and I propose system three, imagination. Anticipate using rigorous imagination. You use imagination rigorously. If you want to bring your analytical faculties, the throbbing left brains that we all have, to bear on the future, you're going to have to create a fictional object for analysis because it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, and it's not predictable. And to imagine that object rigorously, you're going to have to create multiple different future visions. And I'm going into basically what is scenario planning. These are principles of scenario planning, but I think any approach to real fundamental uncertainty is going to have to abide by some of the principles I will give to you here. Multiple scenarios of the future to be rigorous. You've got to spread your view of what can be. So how can imagination be rigorous? The rigor of math and science is vertical, according to Edward de Bono's lateral thinking and his other books. It dives down deep in one place. It's got 8 decimal places of precision and depth and accuracy, and it is exact, but it is misapplied when it is used on fundamentally unpredictable things where you can't get that level of certainty. So the rigor of imagination is horizontal. It's spread out. You're trying to get the widest range of plausible possible outcomes so you can think about them. You have to give up prediction to do that, though. You can't use prediction, so it lacks precision, but it allows us to break out of our present mindset and to anticipate things that prediction just cannot help you anticipate. So the question I would have for all of you, you don't have to yell it out or anything, but just think about what's really changed your world of work in the last 20 years. Was it something that was within your pre-existing mental model of what your world was about? Or was it something that swept in from left or right field and changed everything?
Always sweet.
Yeah.
Always sweet.
Yeah. And for me, 9/11 really kind of like made people not want to do long range planning for a while, ironically. And then the 2008 financial meltdown, same thing. Just when they really needed it, they said, "Oh, we can't do it. We're in a crisis." So, and then when your spouse comes to you and says, "Hey, we're moving to New Zealand," that could be another one. And I never should have told her that was one of the 2 countries I would be willing to work to move to. So the goal of rigorous imagination is to anticipate an arbitrary number of future eventualities, plausible future eventualities that are of strategic importance to your world of work, and then analyze their implications. You are not trying to predict the future, but you are trying to bring to the surface issues and things that prediction can't bring you. I'll show you an example for you. And then you get to apply your left brain, because we all want to apply our left brain and vivisect the object that we've created so that we can draw some inferences about what might be in the future. So I'm going to give you some principles of what I call rigorous imagination, which really are principles of scenario planning. And I'm not trying to sell anybody on this stuff because I'm lazy and I'm near the end of my career. And but I just want to put out the word that somebody ought to be doing this. People ought to be doing this. They ought to be. It ought to have a much higher saliency within organizations because it's not done, and we stumble into these catastrophes over and over again, even though we could have anticipated them and done something. So the first principle is abandon certainty. You're not going to anticipate everything. You know, this isn't prediction. You will anticipate a whole lot of stuff that you wouldn't have otherwise, and you'll probably be better off than the people that don't do that in your marketplace. But you can't anticipate everything. You have to seriously face that blankness of the future. You're in this cotton candy fog that you're looking forward towards. And what you've got to do is you've got to lay down a grid on that stuff. You've got to lay down a mental grid on what the future could be plausibly. The way to do that is you've got to identify, and I'll show an example of this, a few high-level defining variables that will serve as sort of axes, a Cartesian coordinate system of all the world of possible futures that you can face. And the criterion can't be probability. There's no most probable future. Anytime the future has a sufficient amount of detail that you've done, that's another prediction, and its level of probability goes rapidly to zero. You can still, if you do multiple ones though that are systematically spread across future space, then you got something, because you will be testing ideas about how the world can evolve. You won't be predicting. So again, the criteria must be impact in your world of work, not probabilities, and get a future time horizon that is uncomfortable and far beyond your normal planning range. We did work for the Panama Canal Commission in 1997, and we developed this rule of thumb: 18 months equals 43 years, because we were looking out to 2040, because they were trying to make the decision about whether to construct a third set of locks and lanes, which they eventually did. And fortunately, we told them to do it. But we had 5 scenarios for them. One of the scenarios was a climate change scenario. It was even before Al Gore got all exercised about it. And it had drought in Panama. And they begged us to drop this scenario. They said, we're going to lose all kinds of credibility. Nobody's going to believe this. We've only had too much rain and too much water here since 1914. And we barely held our ground. And within 18 months, our client was calling us and saying, I am living your damn scenario. Are you putting out fires with helicopters on the side of the canal, and we have draft restrictions for the ships? Why did you write this damn thing? So anyway, tried to tell them it wasn't our doing. Hopefully they planned to do some of these things as a result. But more principles. Work from the outside in and the future back. The outside in means, if you're going to construct these scenarios of the future, keep them out of your world of work. Make them general enough so that they're just a description of the world, and you can start to draw inferences to paint it inward once you start analyzing it for your purposes. And you'll have 4 or 5 scenarios maybe, and each one of them will say, this is what the world is like. And then you ask, what's our business look like here? Are we doing okay? And you're at that far distant future date. And for the future back, you're telling a story from today to get to that future. You stipulate the end state conditions. And let me tell you, it's terrifying how plausible you can make almost any story be. It's terrifying if it's a bad scenario. But it's scary how plausible you can make any story once you've created this matrix of different worlds that you could experience. And when in doubt, stretch the possibilities. Don't be afraid to be kooky. Don't eliminate things or censor yourself right away, because I guarantee you some of the kookiest stuff is going to happen within the next 5 years. It's long before your expiration date there. And again, forget probabilities. And as I said before, with the more detail you put into each of these scenarios, the less chance any of them has of coming true. Both Kahneman and Tetlock in their books say we don't like scenarios because you know, we need, Tedlock says, we need to know which one's gonna come true. Well, I hope you realize at this point, at least the way we do scenarios, none of them has a chance of coming true. They're scaffolding. You can, you know, once you're done extracting the ideas and insights about the future, you can just throw away the scaffolding. Although usually they're fun to read later, so don't throw them away. And Kahneman said the same thing. He said the more detail you put in a scenario, the less likely it is that it'll come true. And he said if they're used as tools for forecasting, they're really, you know, confusing and wrong. And my response is don't use them as tools for forecasting. Use them as tools to get insight. And here's a key one, at least for anybody that I know. You need to be willing to be wrong, and this is really hard. If you want to anticipate something big, you got to anticipate about 3 or 4 or 5 things that are not going to happen and take them all seriously because we don't know which ones are going to happen. But at least you'll have thought about all these different things. You'll get a more sophisticated view of the strategic context you're operating in. So you need to be willing to be wrong. And so, and that's hard because we're all graded on being right? But this is something that you can't be right about. No, so you got to be willing to be wrong. And again, the goal is to imagine an arbitrary number of future eventualities of strategic interest and to derive insights from them and analyze them and make strategies to deal with them. After the AI session, I don't know how strong I'll emphasize this one, but don't imagine you can, at least today, you can set up a quantitative model or app to do this job. Because each of these scenarios, any quantitative model or app it's an algorithm. It's got rules, hidden rules inside, and it'll spit out, you know, you put the data in, it'll spit out an answer, one answer. But what we're doing here is we're saying, how could the algorithm itself change form completely? Like the operands and all the, you know, the variables could change completely from scenario to scenario. And so you're imagining how the parameters of the game themselves might change. And very, very important. You know, at work, the best thing to do is work for a philosopher, queen, or king. Somebody who's got a real strategic bent. It's really hard to make this work unless you've got somebody who's got vision in charge and who makes this a priority and who doesn't just see it as an offsite mind expanding thing before you dive into your spreadsheets for budgets.
So Patrick, very interesting. So bringing it to corporations or real life, where would you apply that? And just to give you examples, most of the corporations, whether that's Fortune 100, Fortune 500, or mid-sized companies, we tend to do a 1-year planning, which is very tactical, 5-year throwing it out. Very few go into 2050, like you're talking about the ESG initiatives. And then good companies do that whole risk assessment part, you know, when's the next COVID, when's the next Ukraine war, all that. Help me, where would you apply these things, or would you apply these things in those scenarios?
I think you should do this one first to set the broader context for any further planning activities, because it will stretch everybody's idea of what is plausible, and it will identify things that could really have impact, and then you start with that knowledge. And what you're trying to do is inculcate strategic intent into your organization. It's and you want it plugged into the established power centers, the resource allocators, people who are equipped in. Thad Allen, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, said that's what inculcating strategic intent in the organization is. It's his phrase, and they're still doing this. They decided we were too expensive to continue, so we're not doing it anymore. For them, but we did it for 15 years, and we set up their sort of strategic visioning process.
I just add a smaller comment in that kind of area. So pricing is my area, and I deal with companies all the time that absolutely set a pricing strategy and they think it's going to go forever. But if you look back at the last 15 years, there have been 8 transitions that 90% of you should have wildly changed your pricing strategy either in a good way, in an up way, or you are in a defend mode kind of way. And mostly when things turn south is when people get more surprised. But it just amazes me, everybody acts and never puts in competencies
Right.
for the fact that one thing we can be sure of, it's going to change, and probably within 1 or 2 years, you're going to be in a different environment, and certainly scenario planning is what we use for the longer term crazy things that can happen.
Yeah, and it's impossible to time those things,
Right.
I mean, look at what happened in 2007, 2008. All the economists, there were 45 economists
I think
that,
I follow the best economists in the world, and their notes now start with, yeah, like I was clueless.
yeah.
Everything that.
For some reason, since 2016, it's easy to write crazy scenarios for our clients. I don't know why.
Most of what you've been talking about is quantitative forecasting, numerical.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
lately.
I have been to 1 million conferences, and a great way to have a great conference is to put one of these futurists on the program.
Yeah.
And
You know what?
mostly
You're all
tech-
futurists.
Yeah, they're mostly
I'm no more
technology.
futurist than you are. So.
They're mostly technology futurists.
Yeah.
Nobody ever goes back to check whether they were right. I probably.
It's a great gig. It's a great
Well,
gig.
there's a question at the end of this. I probably heard a dozen futurists in the decade before the internet happened. And I never heard anyone forecast the internet. I remember one guy talking about this thing called hypertext. I didn't know what he was talking about. I think they were already working on it.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Well, actually, we were working for IBM in 1995. And I specifically remember walking in with my partners into a meeting of the IBM fellows, who are really the big brains of the organization. And some of them were leading lights in the beginning of the internet. And as we walked in the door, my partner leaned over to me and said, "The average IQ in this room just dropped 40%. And we actually did at least one scenario that was pretty accurately conveyed how the internet was going to roll out. And that was due to the client having having the expertise to give us the ideas of how it might happen in the future.
Patrick, and it kind of builds on what he asked, I think. Have you seen companies use it to help shape where they want to go in the future? Meaning, they might have 40 choices of markets or applications to help them
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
select, and not all those will probably pan out.
Yeah.
But-
Pfizer was one of our clients back in the 90s. I would love to say that we did Viagra, but Viagra was already out by that time. So, but their therapeutic initiatives group did scenarios to try to figure out which were the right things to invest. So, yeah.
Yeah, disclaimer, I don't have nearly the business experience of most people here. I just MBA grad, but I have philosophy background, so I really appreciate what you're bringing up here. Especially because I think when you ground things in the imagination, that comes from embodied experience and common sense, as compared to analyzing social constructs,
Yeah.
which can get detached from common sense.
Right.
And I think the adage of, plans are useless, but planning is essential.
Right.
You're inculcating habits
Right.
of people to really tune into their experience and what they can imagine to be possible. And I think in building the strategic capacities of an organization, that's really a helpful exercise for people.
All right, I'm gonna sprint through these last ones. That was a great point. I have this dorky thing where I tried to put it into one slide, all these different principles. You can see all the things I just said. There's almost all of them are jammed into this one slide. So, it's kind of messy, but anyway. Let me give you an example. May seem familiar. Okay. Variant of the supposedly beaten SARS coronavirus makes its way into the United States. First, the virus is downplayed by public officials. Voters start dying in Western port cities. Public officials urge calm. But then evidence links China to the new virus. Wave of xenophobia sweeps across the United States. The borders start getting closed and air travel is shut down a little bit. And yet even with these restrictions, the disease could not be halted. Public health infrastructure was not adequate to contain the outbreak. After 2 months, only the most remote areas of the US had been spared. And deaths were about 2% of those who got the disease. But this was still far beyond the experience of any but the oldest citizens. Pandemic took 100 times as many lives as 9/11, and the virus was nationwide. Asian Americans were suddenly under suspicion. Schools emptied for months. Technology became an invasive force in American society. Air travel collapsed. All unnecessary air travel was sort of canceled, and teleconferences, which had been predicted for decades to substitute for actual travel, finally became an everyday reality. But then a second wave of infection hit the United States extremely hard. But new medicines and treatment regimens were finally beating back this attack. Other countries, most our allies, were decrying America's sudden shift against international institutions and the world order that it had spent so much time constructing. Global trade had been knocked down to almost zero, and then it was getting back to its feet at far lower levels with new restrictions, and millions of more people worldwide died of the virus and from gutting of public health infrastructures. So, sounds familiar? A little bit off, maybe, I don't know. Now consider that scenario was written in 2003 by me. And with help from our client, the United States Coast Guard, and my colleagues. And I'll show you how we did it, why we wrote the pandemic scenario. You can look this up on the internet, Code Quebec, US Coast Guard. If you Google it, you'll find the text and much more. Basically, you see, when I talked about the dimensions, the defining X, Y, and Z axes and all that stuff, we had 4 of them for this group of scenarios. And this particular scenario had the rate of globalization decreasing and a weak economy, high perception of threat to society, and the US concept of sovereignty was expansive, meaning the government was getting involved in a lot more stuff, more areas. And we couldn't figure out how to make this world work because we had a war in 2003 at the time, and globalization was still going gangbusters. And it was almost impossible to imagine that it would ever stop at that point. It's really hard to build a story. And then finally we said, okay, what could stop it? Oh, pandemic. So we started doing research on pandemics. And I started reading books on pandemics. Not sleeping at night after reading about them. They usually are coronaviruses. They usually come out of China. And they had that level of death. The Spanish flu had that level of death. So I plugged that in. And so we got an awful lot right. And but that's not the end of the story. How do we predict COVID-19 17 years early? I sort of explained to you how we came to that conclusion. And the answer is we didn't. But premonitions like this one are not only possible, but I think are really our duty as not only just organizational, people in businesses and government, et cetera, but as citizens to start thinking in these terms. We need imagination. And here's the real story. You saw a lot of dots in that account of the plague. All right. Between the dots were some things we got wrong. We had it happening in 2005. China in the scenario was hurt a lot worse and was reviled worldwide because they were the source of the pandemic. And we thought the US would be the best off because we had the best public health infrastructure. Supposedly, we had the most resources for public health. We did not anticipate a rapid vaccine development. And we didn't anticipate the biggest issue of all, which was the lack of societal cohesion that made any kind of uniform public health approach in the US workable. But the scenario did have some real impact, although the Admiral Vivian Cray, who was the head of our group, curses me forever because she was made principal federal official for pandemic response from 2005 to 2007. So all Coast Guard officers hate being in Washington. So she had her tour extended for that and had to work on that stuff. But they made a lot of contingency plans. They got some PPE, some stocks put in. And if the pandemic had occurred a few years earlier, it really would have helped. but the tsunami of the budget, it comes in and sweeps away money and comes back and forth. And the financial crisis kind of took away a lot of the focus and resources. I mean, it's known, widely known that supposedly the Trump administration didn't continue the pandemic response policies of the Obama administration. But what is less known is that the Obama administration itself stopped the Bush administration's pandemic response stuff because they were coming into a situation in January of 2009 where we were at minus 9% growth and losing 800,000 jobs a month. And everything was focused on reversing that trend. And so pandemic response was not top of mind. But then the H1N1 pandemic happened, didn't really kill anybody. But Obama decided, okay, we got to be ready for a pandemic. And he restored a lot of the preparations. But again, and then the Trump administration came in, and as every administration comes in, they reverse a lot of the policies of the previous one.
I have a question related to that, and it's fascinating because I wrote my dissertation on how managers react to uncertainty and different kinds of uncertainty, and based both on the data.
Bill, you should be giving this.
Oh, not at all. I'm but I actually have a question for you because what I see on the data and when talking with firms is very much aligned with what you're saying. Sometimes when the future is unpredictable, a lot of companies that I talk to start scenario planning.
Yeah.
But how they act on the scenario from what I've seen is vastly different. On the one hand, you have one company that picks one scenario, invests in that scenario,
Okay.
and then everything else is contingency.
Yeah.
And then on the very end, you have the companies I'll just sit on a pile of cash, make sure that we're super agile, and we'll be responsive as quickly as we can, and everything in between. So my question to you, in related to tying to what you're saying, is what's your take on what you do with the scenarios and act on them or not?
Well, what we generally do is we run workshops, and each scenario has a team, and it develops strategy as if that scenario is definitely going to take place. They develop a series of strategies and initiatives. So there are 4 or 5 different world teams that are working separately, and then they all come together. And we try to stress test across the different worlds, see how the strategies from one world will work in the other 3 or 4 worlds. And we try to see what core of strategies is going to work no matter what. And then after that comes the contingencies. We try to see what strategies will be definitely necessary in this world, but will be disastrous in that world. And so we develop 2 sets of strategies. And then we sit back and say, what other insights do we have? Because sometimes the insights are more important than any of the strategies you come up with. You really realize, oh, wow, this really is a choke point. This is critical. This thing that we thought was critical is not critical at all. And that's basically how we use it. So anyway, I'm close to the end here. So final thoughts. Yeah.
Sorry, maybe to add on to a couple of things. And I think Bill Gates didn't predict COVID, but he did anticipate and warn that we weren't ready as a society to deal with whatever the pandemic would exactly wrongly or rightly look like. And my point is, it's not about the scenarios really. The way we apply it in transformational anticipated futures is we have a scenario, for example, for Pepsi. Imagine due to whatever climate change, having mass crops of potatoes across the world is no longer possible. And sorry, my French, your Lay's, what do? So then there's a number of scenarios like, oh, we go to other ingredients and try to make chips out of something else. Or we do mass cooking classes and learn people how to make chips and grow their own potatoes in their own backyard, et cetera, et cetera. But you throw
that's why I'm here right now, because of potato failure.
But you throw away the scenario and we back future and say which of these solutions could also anticipate anything else to happen.
Right.
And you go for a common threat. I mean, that's the way it's used, right?
Yes, I think it is.
Just a question about the example scenario that you shared. Just to give me some context, what was the ask that led to you developing that scenario, and how many scenarios did you develop in response?
We developed 5 scenarios looking out to, I think it was 2025 for the Coast Guard for that year, because they had to plan to build ships that are going to last 40 or 50 years. So So that we, you know, there, one scenario was about climate change in the Arctic. One was, you know, obviously what we called SARS-2, by the way, called that one too, because SARS-CoV-2 is the official name of COVID-19. So I had SARS-2 and I blanked it out and put the virus in this example. But it was just their strategic planning process. It was the beginning of a commandant's term. We decided, once we set up this project Evergreen, okay, first we'll do the scenarios, then we'll bring in the budgeteers and the people that are planning for resource allocation, et cetera, and the other development projects they had for shipbuilding and things like that. And you know, and they've done that ever since on a 4-year term. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, yeah. It helps kind of show how we might consider adopting similar processes organizationally.
Yeah, I would really recommend doing it at the beginning of a term of a new leader, because it gives that person the context strategically within which they may have to make decisions. So my final thoughts are you know, the original version of this, I said, we suck at this. Because I've been doing this for a long time. It's really hard to get organizations to really take this in at the gut level. I mean, if you got numbers and quantitative approaches and stuff, you will be honored, you will be rewarded, you will get bonuses. I mean, David Vineyard, the CFO of Goldman Sachs, who said 25 standard deviation, he got severely punished. He was forced out 6 years later. It only got $50 million in 2007 for compensation, over 50 million. And then he got kicked, you know, unceremoniously kicked upstairs to the board of directors for 4 meetings a year for $650,000 a year. So let that be a warning to all of you. Okay. So I'm hoping someday this changes and that we teach this better, we study it, we refine it, and we improve it, because there's got to be a better way to do this than the way we've been doing it. Sometimes we've had tremendous success, but it's very hit or miss. It's hard to get organizations to take this in and do it right. And I think for the sake of the world, really, we need much more imagination, and we need it before we start spitting out the numbers, even though we love doing it. So, and the point is to avoid failures of imagination. And this actually got this from WikiQuote. I like to. There's another version of this at Disney World that's a little more pithy, but apparently Einstein said this: imagination is more important than knowledge. The other version is because everything that is known first had to be imagined, and I think that's true as well. So that's my spiel. Now you can throw your tomato. Any more questions or anything? Or? The drinks are waiting.
Do you think there is any value in purchasing market reports? Purchasing market reports.
You know, I think there is some value. I don't know. I honestly, I'm you know, I'm not close enough to the world anymore.
Maybe they'll stir your imagination.
Yeah, if they broaden your idea of what's possible. Yes.
Okay.
But of course, you don't know until you pay it, probably, so.
That's okay. Just one last comment, you know, in the B2B consulting world, it seems like clients are always willing to spend money on production.
Yeah.
Because it gives them some certainty. And they're never willing to spend money, you know, with a consultant for scenario planning.
Yeah.
You know, and I wonder, like, how can I take the nuggets out of this? When someone says, yeah, we're not gonna do the scenario planning, but we've got, you know, $1 million to spend on prediction.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, we've done planning for, you know, intelligence community and stuff like that. But when I see like them spending for the super forecasters for this IARPA thing, I'm like, that every cent that was spent on that was taxpayer money down the drain, as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
It's not even nice to know. It's fun to know what somebody thinks is the possibility. It's fun to know, but it's not even.
To human nature.
Yeah.
Scenario planning, that sounds like a lot of work and I'm not sure we're ever gonna use it.
Yeah, and it is tough because you really do want to put some of your best people on this, and it's going to be an extended deal. for you to, you know, that you're gonna, I mean, whoever's running the thing is gonna have the expertise, subject matter expertise of really good people to make it work.
Do you have
And of
any
course-
commercial, any companies that have really embraced this as part of their culture, part of their operating?
Maybe a case study you
Model.
could share.
Publicly traded companies, it's like companies that are known to really do this.
I'm not, you know what, I can't say that there aren't any, because I've been away from that a little while, been doing more like nonprofits and government stuff lately, but yeah.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of really big companies are using strategic foresight. Autodesk uses it quite effectively. Disney uses it. Pepsi uses it. Full motor companies use it. So it is, but I mean, your points are great. It's not.
IHG.
It's like, yeah, and I bet, I mean, I worked in the beverage industry for a while. I worked for NutraSweet before I started doing this crazy stuff. In fact, I started doing scenario planning there, but, and NutraSweet is no more, so.
It's interesting to know that there are some companies using it, but I think to Tim's question was, or someone's question, has anyone actually publicly talked about how they're using it, and what it did for them? Looking, I don't know if they actually wrote their case study yet, but I do know that HEB, which is the grocery store in Texas, they did a scenario analysis planning exercise years ago. What if there's a pandemic? What are we going to do? And I think there may have been a write-up about that. I'm not sure. I'll see if I can.
That does not surprise me, because our organization worked for a foundation that was funded by that chain to do scenarios of future schools in Texas.
Okay, maybe that was it, but I thought I remember reading about that.
Yeah,
I think Shell did that.
Shell was very famous in the
Yeah.
1980s. The book, The Art of the Long View, was written in 1991
Yes.
by Peter Schwartz, and yeah, they were famous for a while for that. And
Like a time horizon issue with the management, I mean, 40 years.
yeah, you know what? I would be lying if I said we could maintain 40 years. It's definitely come closer and closer in over the years. The cycle times have increased. If we can get 10 years, we can probably live with that. The important thing isn't the number, it's getting getting people's heads out of their inbox. You know, if they're, you know, it's the tyranny of the present we want to get out of. And because if you're far enough, you need to be far enough out so that people's personal interests are not going to be directly involved. So you want to, and it's fun. It's fun to do this, as long as it's far enough out so you're not going to get somebody, you know, fired, including yourself. So,
Thank you.
yeah, but you're right. I mean, 40 years is a big ask. I mean, it's good for the Coast Guard of the Panama Canal, but.
But any other predictions that your prediction is pretty accurate, depending on how.
Not a prediction.
Okay.
You're trying to trap me, aren't you?
No, he was just smart enough not to put a date on it.
Yeah, I didn't get the date right. You can't really predict this stuff. I mean, you can, like I said, you can anticipate. We were able to anticipate in detail the way that, you know, the thing was gonna roll out. And but it's just, boy, it's hard to keep to you know, catastrophe prevention is almost impossible. Humans are not built for that. Taleb in the Black Swan, he says, what if someone had invented a locking cabin door for all jetliners in America, and it was put in, you know, September 9th, 2001? You know, what credit would that person get? You know, and people who don't get credit tend to die earlier. So I'd like to go and put flowers on this person's grave, but I don't know who they are. I don't know where they are, because they prevented a catastrophe, but they were not rewarded for it. And
Patrick, my experience is a lot of companies that do scenario planning are the ones that they have a known uncertainty, like they know an environmental thing could happen and affect their business, so they're willing to do it. They know a major product's coming off patent and they don't know what is going to
that's
happen.
like almost like a war game type thing.
Yeah,
Right?
like they know within the 3 to 5 years, who knows what. So do you think that businesses that don't have anything on the uncertainty, like nothing major really you know, in their spotlight ought to be doing it, or should be some
Yeah.
inkling that you're in an industry or a market that is going to see some?
We used to divide our clients into type A and type B, and type A was a client that was at the top of its game and had were relaxed enough to say, hey, let's look out further.
Mhm.
You know, we're doing really well. Let's really look out further. And type B was, we are really in trouble. Let's do some scenarios because we really don't know how we're gonna get out of this. And how can we get out, you know, there was a mining company out west that did that as well. And for us, that was type B. Type A was, I don't know, it wasn't IBM because they had just stopped wearing suits back in '95. And they were all freaking out because they were wearing sweaters and they didn't know what to do. They were walking down the hall without their ties and yeah, they were freaking out. But thank God we told them to stay in the mainframe business because otherwise that would have been, they make a lot of money.
Is there any cultural bias where certain cultures or countries are very more predisposed to?
Well, finance tends to want to make things that are quantitative. We work for some financial firms, but we've kept to our guns about keeping it more qualitative and saying, we did a Y2K thing for I think it was Merrill Lynch. I wasn't involved in that particular one, but it was really good that we did that because we told them to establish backup systems, et cetera, in New Jersey. And all this stuff got wiped out in 9/11, even though Y2K turned into nothing.
Yeah.
So those scenarios paid off. But I would say, if the more left brain an organization is, the harder it is. If it's an engineering culture, sometimes engineers are really, really broad gauge thinkers. They're surprisingly nuanced. But if it's an engineering culture where precision is the ultimate good, then sometimes it's hard to work with them.